Avoidants don't fall in love when they feel close. They fall in love when they feel safe from losing themselves. For an avoidant, emotional connection is never experienced as warmth first. It is experienced as threat. Where a secure or anxious partner feels closeness as grounding, the avoidant nervous system interprets it as potential loss of autonomy. Love in real time doesn't feel romantic to them. It feels like pressure. Pressure to show up consistently, pressure to be emotionally accessible, pressure to merge lives, needs, and expectations. So instead of relaxing into the bond, they begin regulating against it. They intellectualize, they distract, they downplay, they create space, not because they don't care, but because caring feels like standing too close to something that could swallow them whole. Their guardedness isn't coldness, it's self protection learned long before you arrive. During the relationship, every moment of intimacy activates a silent internal calculation. How much of myself am I losing right now? Love doesn't land as safety, it lands as obligation. Even reassurance can feel like a demand, even affection can feel like a tether. So they stay partially disengaged, not fully present, not fully gone. They convince themselves they're unsure, not ready, or emotionally limited. But the truth is simpler and harder to accept. Their system doesn't feel safe enough to let love in while the relationship is alive and active. After the relationship ends, something crucial changes. The pressure evaporates. There is no one waiting for a response, no one reading their tone, no one asking for clarity, consistency, or emotional reciprocity. The invisible contract of intimacy dissolves, and with it, the threat, their nervous system finally exits survival mode. This is the moment people misunderstand. They assume the feelings appear because the relationship ended. In reality, the feelings were always there, they were just buried beneath fear. Distance doesn't create love for avoidance, it creates safety. And safety is the prerequisite for emotional access. Once the relationship is over, love becomes theoretical instead of experiential. It's remembered, not required. Felt, not acted on. There's no risk of being consumed by it now. They can miss you without vulnerability. Reflect without responsibility. Appreciate without exposure. The same emotions that felt overwhelming in real time now feel manageable in hindsight. That's why avoidants often report realizing their feelings only after the loss. Not because the bond suddenly deepened, but because the nervous system finally slowed down enough register what was already there. This is the part that's painful for the partner who was present the whole time. You didn't imagine the connection, you weren't too much, you weren't demanding something unreasonable. You were simply loving someone whose internal safety system couldn't keep up with the emotional reality you were offering. Their delayed love is not proof that you mattered more after you left. It's proof that closeness was never the issue, safety was. And by the time safety arrived, you were no longer there to receive the love that required your absence to exist. Closeness overwhelms them. Distance organizes them. For avoidance, emotion is not the problem, intensity is. When you were present, when the relationship was active, their emotional world felt loud and invasive. Feelings didn't arrive gently, they arrived all at once, tangled with expectations, responsibility, and the unspoken requirement to respond in real time. Every emotion demanded action. Every moment of closeness required regulation. So instead of experiencing feelings as information, they experienced them as interruption. Love felt less like something to move toward and more like something that needed to be managed, contained, or postponed. Distance changes that dynamic entirely. Space removes immediacy, and immediacy is what overwhelms the avoidant nervous system. When there is no longer a need to reply, reassure, clarify, or show up emotionally on cue, the body relaxes, the mind slows down. Emotions stop feeling like emergencies and start feeling like thoughts. This is why avoidants often seem more reflective, more sentimental, and more emotionally articulate after a relationship ends. Not because they suddenly became deeper, but because the emotional demand was finally lowered to a level their system could tolerate. With distance, they can feel without responding. They can think without committing. They can miss you without exposing themselves to vulnerability. Longing becomes safe when it doesn't require expression. Appreciation becomes accessible when it doesn't come with responsibility. In the absence of the relationship, emotions lose their edge. They become quieter, more organized, easier to sit with. This is the environment in which avoidance can finally access the feelings they appeared disconnected from while you were still there. The painful irony is that your presence was never the problem. The intensity of real-time emotional engagement while you were in the relationship, your needs, your reactions, and your emotional availability created a living, breathing feedback loop. For an avoidant, that loop feels relentless. Even healthy connection can feel like pressure when the nervous system is wired to equate closeness with loss of control. So they unconsciously rely on distance to do the emotional work they can't do while attached. This is also why avoidants often idealize partners after separation. Memory is easier than reality. It doesn't demand regulation. It doesn't challenge autonomy. It doesn't require consistency. In memory, you become simplified, softened, stripped of conflict and complexity. And in that simplified emotional space, love finally feels manageable. Not because it grew stronger, but because it no longer threatens their sense of self. For the partner who lived inside the relationship, this realization can feel devastating. You carried the emotional weight while they appeared absent, only for them to find their feelings when you're gone. But this isn't a failure on your part. It's a limitation in how their system processes closeness. Distance didn't make you more valuable. It made emotion less threatening. And love that can only be processed when diluted by space was never something you could fix by staying, explaining, or loving harder. Avoidants don't fall in love in real time. They fall in love in retrospect. While the relationship is alive, avoidants are not fully inhabiting the moment. They are managing it. Their attention isn't on the connection itself, but on regulating the discomfort the connection activates. Every emotionally charged interaction pulls their focus inward. Am I overwhelmed? Am I being asked for more than I can give? How do I maintain space without causing conflict? In this state, presence becomes fragmented. Even meaningful moments are filtered through self-protection. Love may be happening, but it's happening under tension, and tension blocks emotional integration. Once the relationship ends, that tension dissolves. The nervous system exits defense mode. The constant need to monitor closeness disappears. And with that relief comes something new, perspective. Memory becomes the place where emotions finally organize themselves. Without the pressure of responding, explaining, or showing up in real time, the avoidant mind begins to reconstruct the relationship in a safer form. Sharp edges soften, conflicts lose their urgency. What once felt overwhelming is now just information. This is when appreciation finally becomes accessible. In memory, you are no longer a living emotional presence with needs and reactions. You become symbolic. You represent care, warmth, stability, or connection without the demand to reciprocate in the moment. That symbolic version of you feels safe, and safety is what allows feeling. This is why avoidants often appear more loving after the fact. They're not responding to who you were in real time. They're responding to a version of you that no longer requires vulnerability. This doesn't mean they were lying when they seemed unsure during the relationship. It means their system was overloaded. When emotional bandwidth is consumed by regulation, there's no room left for reflection or appreciation. They couldn't fully register what you meant because they were too busy trying not to lose themselves inside the bond. Retrospective love isn't delayed affection, it's delayed awareness. The tragedy is that memory removes the very things that made the relationship real. It erases mutual negotiation, emotional risk, and accountability. In hindsight, love becomes clean and uncomplicated because the difficult parts that required growth are gone. What remains is essence, how you made them feel at their best, not how the relationship challenged them at their most vulnerable. And in that simplified emotional landscape, love finally feels easy. For the person who lived the relationship in real time, this can feel deeply invalidating. You showed up through the complexity, the tension, the unmet needs, only to be appreciated once. None of it matters anymore. But this isn't proof that you are better as a memory than a partner. It's proof that their nervous system could only process love when stripped of immediacy. You didn't fail to be lovable in the moment. They failed to be present enough to receive it. Once they no longer have you, they stop resisting you. For avoidance, love is rarely just about affection. It's about control. Not control over the other person, but control over themselves, their space, their emotional boundaries. While the relationship is active, Every step toward closeness can feel like a step away from autonomy. Love becomes a negotiation between wanting connection and protecting independence. And when that negotiation feels unbalanced, resistance emerges, not because the bond lacks meaning, but because meaning feels dangerous when it threatens self control. During the relationship, the internal battle is constant. Attachment pulls them in, fear pushes them back. Each expression of need can feel like an encroachment. Each expectation can feel like a loss of freedom. So they resist subtly or overtly. They withdraw, minimize, delay, or create emotional distance. From the outside, it looks like ambivalence. From the inside, it feels like survival. Love isn't experienced as something mutual and expansive. It's experienced as something that must be managed to prevent collapse after the breakup. That struggle disappears. There is no longer a tug of war between independence and attachment because attachment no longer requires participation. Control returns to their hands completely. No one is asking anything of them. No one is waiting. No one is pulling them closer. And in that regained autonomy, the nervous system relaxes. The need to resist fades. When there's nothing left to push against, the pushing stops. This is where curiosity re-enters. Without the threat of losing control, they can finally look back at the relationship without defensiveness. They can revisit moments without bracing. They can acknowledge impact without fearing obligation. And in that calm, something uncomfortable often surfaces. The realization that the connection mattered more than they allowed themselves to admit. Not because it was perfect, but because it challenged them in ways that mattered. Love wasn't missing during the relationship, it was being fought internally, quietly, often unconsciously. They weren't choosing distance over you, they were choosing self-preservation over vulnerability. And once self-preservation is no longer necessary, the truth becomes harder to ignore. The bond had weight, the loss has consequence, and the absence creates a clarity that presence never allowed. For the partner on the receiving end, this realization can feel cruel. You experienced resistance where there could have been collaboration. You felt the pushback without knowing it was coming from fear, not lack of feeling. But this delayed clarity doesn't mean you were wrong to want closeness. It means the relationship activated a power struggle they weren't equipped to resolve. Once you were gone, the struggle ended, and only then did they stop resisting what they had already lost. Regret feels safer than showing up. For avoidance, intimacy isn't frightening because of emotion itself. It's frightening because intimacy requires exposure. It asks them to be seen in real time, to respond honestly, to stay present when discomfort arises. During the relationship, demands participation. It requires consistency, repair, and emotional risk. And risk is exactly what the avoidant nervous system is trained to avoid. So even when feelings exist, engaging with them feels more dangerous than suppressing them. After the relationship ends, that danger disappears. Regret replaces intimacy, and regret is emotionally accessible in a way closeness never was. They can miss you without the possibility of rejection. They can feel love without having to express it. They can sit in longing without being asked to act. Regret is private, contained, and consequence-free. It allows emotional depth without vulnerability, and that makes it feel safe. This is why avoidants often report feeling more after the ending than during the relationship. The emotional door opens wider once no one is on the other side of it. They are no longer required to regulate your reactions or meet your needs. The fear of being inadequate, exposed, or overwhelmed fades, and in that safety, emotion finally flows. What looks like delayed love is actually delayed permission to feel. Regret also removes accountability. Loving someone in the present comes with responsibility to communicate, to choose, to repair when things break. Regret asks for none of that. It allows them to emotionally engage without confronting the ways they avoided, withdrew, or failed to show up. The feeling can be pure because it is disconnected from action. This is why regret can feel so intense. It is unchallenged by reality, but this intensity is misleading. The depth they feel after the end is not evidence that the bond grew stronger. It's evidence that the threat of being seen is gone. In the relationship, being seen meant risk. After the breakup, being unseen becomes safety. They can idealize the connection because it no longer tests them. They can feel remorse without repair, longing without vulnerability, love without the possibility of failure. For the person who lived inside the relationship, this can feel deeply unfair. You wanted presence, not post-loss insight. You asked for engagement, not hindsight. But the regret is not a measure of your value. It's a measure of their fear, and love that can only be felt safely in absence was never something you could secure by staying longer or trying harder. Intimacy asks for courage. Regret asks for nothing and for avoidance. That difference is everything. They don't just miss you, they miss the version of themselves they never fully became. When avoidants say they miss you, what they're often responding to is not only your absence, but the disappearance of a mirror you once held up for them. In your presence, something softer was invited out, something more emotionally alive. You reflected back warmth, possibility, and a depth they rarely allow themselves to explore. That reflection was unsettling while the relationship was active, because becoming that version of themselves required vulnerability, and vulnerability felt like danger. During the relationship, they stood at the edge of that version of themselves without fully stepping into it. They felt the pull toward growth, intimacy, and emotional expansion, and simultaneously felt the urge to retreat. So they hovered in between, half present, half protected. You could sense the potential, even when they couldn't sustain it. They weren't rejecting you. They were resisting a self that felt unfamiliar and unsafe to inhabit. After the relationship ends, that reflection disappears. There is no longer someone inviting depth out of them, no one encouraging softness, no one holding space for the parts of themselves they kept hidden. And in that absence, something becomes painfully clear. A version of themselves was lost along with you. Not because it couldn't exist, but because they were too afraid to fully become it. This is where grief enters, often mislabeled as love. They mourn not just the relationship, but the identity they briefly touched and then abandoned. They remember how they felt around you, more open, more connected, more human. And now, without you there to reflect that back, the contrast becomes sharp. Their familiar emotional distance returns, and it feels emptier than before. The confusion comes from the overlap between self-loss and partner loss. They assume they miss you, when what they are actually missing is the internal shift your presence created. This is why their longing can feel intense yet unfocused. It's not directed at rebuilding connection, it's directed at the awareness of something within themselves that slipped away. That grief is real, but it's not always relational. It's existential. For the person who is in the relationship, this distinction matters. You weren't just loved for who you were significant for who you helped them access. That doesn't make the connection false, but it explains why they didn't sustain it. Becoming that fuller version of themselves required courage. They hadn't developed yet, so instead of stepping into it, they retreated and only recognized the loss once it was gone. This is why their missing can feel disconnected from action. They may feel deeply, yet remain passive, because what they're grieving is not something they know how to reclaim through relationship. It's a self they avoided becoming. And no amount of returning to you can fix that unless they're willing to face the fear that kept them from inhabiting that version of themselves in the first place. By the time they understand what you were, you're already gone. Avoidants don't reach out when the loss first happens. In the beginning, separation often feels like relief. The pressure is gone. The emotional noise quiets. Autonomy returns. For a while, it can even feel like confirmation that ending things was the right choice. But this phase isn't clarity, it's decompression. Only after the nervous system fully settles do the deeper emotions begin to surface. And by the time they do, time has already passed. As distance stretches on, reflection replaces defense. The urgency to protect themselves fades, and the mind begins to replay what was once pushed aside. Moments resurface. Patterns become visible. The weight of the connection finally registers. This is when awareness arrives. Late, slow, and often unwelcome. Not as certainty, but as a quiet recognition that mattered more than I admitted. When they reach out, it's rarely confident or decisive. It's hesitant, indirect, often disguised as something casual. A check-in, a memory, a neutral message that doesn't fully expose intent. This tentativeness isn't manipulation, it's fear. Even now, love still feels dangerous. Reaching out risks rejection, vulnerability, and emotional exposure, the very things they spent the relationship avoiding. So they test the water instead of diving in. The reach out isn't strategy. It's not a calculated move to regain control or provoke a response. It's delayed awareness colliding with permanent consequence. They finally see the value of the connection, but they no longer know if they're allowed access to it, and that uncertainty is paralyzing. They want reassurance without risk, connection without commitment. Proof you're still there without having to fully show up. For the person on the receiving end, this timing can feel deeply frustrating. You needed clarity when the relationship was alive. You needed effort when it could still change something. Instead, you're offered ambiguity after you've already done the grieving. Their message arrives not as relief, but as disruption, reopening a door you already learned how to close. This late reach out isn't proof that you were forgotten and then remembered. It's proof that understanding came too slowly to meet the moment. Avoidants often require distance to feel, but distance also creates consequences. By the time they're emotionally available, the relationship has moved from present tense to past. And awareness without action, when it arrives too late, becomes regret. This is the quiet tragedy of avoidant love. They don't lose people because they don't care. They lose them because their emotional timing lags behind their reality. And when they finally reach out, it's not to reclaim what was, it's to touch what they now realize they can't. If they fall in love after losing you, it doesn't mean you should wait. When you realize that avoidants often feel the deepest after the relationship ends, it's easy to misinterpret the meaning. You might wonder if timing was the only issue, if patience would have changed the outcome, or if staying longer would have allowed their love to arrive sooner. But their delayed love is not a promise, it's a pattern, and it is not your responsibility to redeem it. You were not unlovable in the relationship. You were not too emotional, too needy, or asking for something unreasonable. You were asking for presence, consistency, and emotional reciprocity, the basic requirements of a healthy bond. The fact that those needs activated fear rather than connection says nothing about your worth. It only reveals where their capacity ended. Being early doesn't mean you were wrong. It means you arrived with readiness. They hadn't developed yet. You showed up in real time, willing to be seen, willing to build something mutual. They required distance to feel safe enough to access emotion, and love that only becomes accessible when you're gone is not love that can sustain intimacy, partnership, or growth. This is the hardest truth to accept. Their post-loss feelings don't mean the relationship would work now. Awareness doesn't equal ability. Regret doesn't equal repair. Feeling something in absence is very different from sustaining it in present. If they haven't addressed the fear that made closeness unbearable, the pattern will repeat, no matter how sincere the realization feels. Waiting for someone to catch up emotionally keeps you suspended in a story that no longer serves you. It asks you to put your life on pause while someone else processes at their own pace. But your healing does not need to align with their awakening. You don't owe them availability just because they finally understand your value. The clarity you gain from this perspective is quiet but powerful. You stop chasing explanations, you stop personalizing the distance, you stop mistaking delayed love for destiny. Instead, you recognize the shift in power. You didn't lose someone who was capable of meeting you. They lost access to someone who was willing to love them in the present. This doesn't make them a villain, and it doesn't make you a lesson. It simply marks the end of a dynamic that asked you to shrink while waiting for someone else to feel safe. Love that requires your absence to exist was never meant to be your future. The freedom comes when you stop hoping they'll arrive and start choosing relationships where love doesn't need distance to survive, where presence is welcomed, not feared, where timing isn't the obstacle, and where you are met, not remembered too late.